Hi, everybody. This is Ms. Brazil again. This is part 2 of Chapter 5 of Artemis Fowl. So if you did not listen to and read along with Chapter 5, Part 1 yet, you need to go back and read that first. Okay? So I'm just going to continue reading, and you're following along. Here we go. Tough nuggets, Root growled at the holiday rep. And what's more, I'm shutting down all non-essential flights until the present crisis is past. And when might that be? Squeaked the irate gnome, brandishing a notebook as though she were prepared to make a complaint of some kind. Root spat out the butt of his cigar, squashing it comprehensively beneath his boot heel. The symbolism was all too obvious. The chutes will be opened, madam, when I feel like it, growled the commander. And if you and your fluorescent uniform don't get out of my way, I'll yank your operating license and have you thrown into the cells for obstructing an LEP officer. The holiday rep wilted before him and slung back into line, wishing her uniform wasn't quite so pink. Foley was waiting at the pod. Serious though the moment was, he couldn't resist an amused whinny at the sight of Root's belly wobbling ever so slightly in his clinging jumpsuit. Are you sure about this, Commander? Generally, we only allow one passenger per pod. What do you mean? Snarled Root. There is only one. Then he caught Foley's meaningful glance at his stomach. Oh. Ha ha, very amusing. Keep it up, Foley. I have my limit, you know. But it was a hollow threat, and they both knew it. Not only had Foley built the communications network from scratch, but he was also a pioneer in the field of flare prediction. Without him, human technology could very easily catch up with the fairy brand. Root strapped himself into the pod. No half-century-old crafts for the commander. This baby was fresh off the assembly line. All silver and shiny with the new jagged fin stabilizers that were supposed to read magma currents automatically. Foal's innovation, of course. For a century or so, his pod designs had leaned toward the futuristic, plenty of neon and rubber. Lately, however, his sensibilities had become more retrospective, replacing the gadgetry with walnut dashes and leather upholstery. Root found this old-style decor strangely comforting. He wrapped his fingers around the joysticks and suddenly realized just how long it had been since he had ridden the hot shots. Foley noticed his discomfort. Don't worry, Chief, he said without the usual cynicism. It's like riding a unicorn. You never forget. Root grunted, unconvinced. Let's get this show on the road, he muttered, before I change my mind. Foley hauled the door across until the suction ring took hold, sealing the portal with a pneumatic hiss. Root's face took on a green hue through the quartz pane. Oh, I lost my place. There it is. He didn't look too scary anymore. Quite the opposite, in fact. Artemis was performing a little field surgery on the fairy locator. It was no mean feat to alter some of the dimensions without destroying the mechanisms. The technologies were most definitely incompatible. Imagine trying to perform open-heart surgery with a sledgehammer. The first problem was opening the cursed thing. The screw heads defied both flathead and Phillips screwdrivers. Even Artemis's extensive set of alien keys were unable to find purchase in the tiny grooves. Think futuristic, Artemis told himself. Think advanced technology. It came to him after a few moments' silent contemplation. Magnetic bolts. Obvious, really. But how to construct a revolving magnetic field in the back of a four-wheel drive? Impossible. The only thing for it was to chase the screws around manually with a domestic magnet. Artemis hunted the small magnet from its niche in this toolbox and applied both poles to the tiny screws. The negative side wiggled them slightly. It was enough to give Artemis some purchase with needle-nose pliers, and he soon had the locator's panel disassembled before him. The circuitry was minute, and not a sign of a solder bead. They must use another form of binder. Perhaps if he had time, the principles of this device could be unraveled, but for now he would have to improvise. He would have to rely on the inattention of others, and if the people were anything like humans, they saw what they wanted to see. Artemis held the locator's face up to the cab's light. It was translucent, slightly polarized, but good enough. He nudged a slew of tiny shimmering wires aside, inserting a buttonhole camera in the space. He secured the pea-sized transmitter with a dab of silicone. Crude, but effective. Hopefully. The magnetic screws refused to be coaxed back into their grooves without the proper tool, so Artemis was forced to glue them too. Messy, but it should suffice, provided the locator wasn't examined too closely. And if it was, well, he could only lose an advantage that he never expected to have in the first place. Butler knocked off his high beams as they entered the city limits. "Dock's coming up, Artemis," he said over his shoulder. "There're bound to be a customs and excise crew around here somewhere." Artemis nodded. It made sense. The port was a thriving artery of illegal activity. Over 50% of the country's contraband made it ashore somewhere along this half-mile stretch. "A diversion then, Butler. 2 minutes are all I need." The manservant nodded thoughtfully. "The usual?" "I don't see why not. Knock yourself out. Or rather, don't." Artemis blinked. That was his second joke in recent times, and his first aloud. Better take care. This was no time for frivolity. The dockers were rolling cigarettes. It wasn't easy with fingers the size of lead bars, but they managed. And if a few strands of brown tobacco dropped to the rough flagstones, what of it? The pouches were available by the carton from a little man who didn't bother adding government tax to his prices. Butler strolled over to the men, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of a watch cap. "Cold night," he said to the assembled group. No one replied. Policemen came in all shapes and sizes. The big stranger persevered. "Even work is better than standing around on a frosty one like tonight." One of the workmen, a bit soft in the head, couldn't help nodding in agreement. A comrade drove an elbow into his ribs. "Still, though," continued the newcomer, "I don't suppose you girls ever did a decent day's work in your lives." Again, no reply, but this time it was because the dockers' mouths were hanging open in amazement. "Yep, you're a pathetic-looking bunch, right enough," went on Butler blithely. "Oh, I've no doubt you would have passed as men during the famine, but by today's standards, you're little more than a pack of blouse-wearing weaklings." "Arg," said one of the dockhands. It was all he could manage. Butler raised an eyebrow. "Arg? Pathetic and inarticulate. Nice combination. Your mothers must be so proud." The stranger had crossed a sacred line. He had mentioned the men's mothers. Nothing could get him out of a beating now, even the fact that he was obviously a simpleton. Albeit a simpleton with a good vocabulary. The men stamped out their cigarettes and spread slowly into a semicircle. It was 6 against 1. You had to feel sorry for them. Butler wasn't finished yet. "Now, before we get into anything, ladies, no scratching, no spitting, and no tattling to Mummy." It was the last straw. The men howled and attacked as one. If they had been paying any attention to their adversary in that moment before contact, they might have noticed that he shifted his weight to lower his center of gravity. They might also have seen that the hands he drew out of his pockets were the size and approximate shape of spades. But no one was paying attention to Butler, too busy watching their comrades, making sure they weren't alone in the assault. The thing about a diversion is that it has to be diverting, Big, crude, not Butler's style at all. He would have preferred to take these gentlemen out from 500 meters with a dart rifle. Failing that, if contact was absolutely necessary, a series of thumb jabs to the nerve cluster at the base of the neck would be his chosen modus operandi, quiet as a whisper. But that would be defeating the purpose of the exercise. And so Butler went against his training, screaming like a demon and utilizing the most vulgar combat actions. Vulgar they may have been, but that's not to say they weren't effective. Perhaps a Shaolin priest could have anticipated some of the more exaggerated movements, but these men were hardly trained adversaries. In fairness, they weren't even completely sober. Butler dropped the first with a roundhouse punch. Two more had their heads clapped together, cartoon style. The fourth, to Butler's eternal shame, dispatched with a spinning kick. But the most ostentatious was saved for the last pair. The manservant rolled onto his back, caught them by the collars of their donkey jackets, and flipped them into Dublin harbor. Big splashes, plenty of wailing. Perfect. Two headlights poked from the black shadow of a cargo container, and a government saloon screeched along the quay. As anticipated, a customs and excise team on stakeout. Butler grinned with grim satisfaction and ducked around the corner. He was long gone before the agents had flipped their badges or begun inquiries. Not that their interrogations would yield much. Big as a house was hardly an adequate description to track him down. By the time Butler reached the car, Artemis had already returned from his mission. "Well done, old friend," he commented, "although I'm certain your martial arts sensei is turning in his grave. A spinning kick? How could you?" Butler bit his tongue, reversing the four-wheel drive off the wooden works. As they crossed the overpass, he couldn't resist glancing down at the chaos he created. The government men were hauling a sodden docker from the polluted waters. Artemis had needed this diversion for something, but Butler knew there was no point in asking what. His employer did not share his plans with anyone until he thought the time was right, and if Artemis Fowl thought the time was right, then it usually was. Root emerged shaking from the pod. He didn't remember it being like this in his time, although truth be told it had been an awful lot worse. Back in the Shelah days, there were no fancy polymer harnesses, no auto thrusters, and certainly no external monitors. It was just gut instinct and a touch of enchantment. In some ways, Root preferred it like that. Science was taking the magic out of everything. He stumbled down the tunnel into the terminal. As the number one preferred destination, Terra had a fully fledged passenger lounge. 6 shuttles a week came in from Haven City alone. Not on the flares, of course. Paying tourists didn't like to be jostled around quite that much, unless, of course, they were on an illegal jaunt to Disneyland. The ferry fort was crammed with full moon overnighters complaining about the shuttle suspensions. A beleaguered sprite was sheltering behind her ticket desk, besieged by angry gremlins. "There's no point in hexing me," squealed the sprite. "There's the elf you want, right there." All right, I'm going to stop reading there for the week. We will finish up chapter 5 next week and then move into chapter 6. You guys did a fantastic job following along. I hope you're all reading at home too and using your Reading Plus. Remember, all of these things are very important. I know right now it's hard to focus and it's hard to feel the motivation to do things, but it's really important that you try to keep up with your reading at the very least, because you don't want those skills to decline. It's going to really impact your school next year, okay? So I appreciate you. Don't forget to post your thoughts in the discussion question. I would love to see you all in book club, and I will talk to you later. Bye.